Everyone to one of the semifinal rounds of the Ethics Bowl here at the Jepson School of Leadership Studies. My name is Mark Hickman. I'll be the moderator for this round. And before we begin, why don't we just go beginning with the judges around the tables and have very brief introductions. I'll begin. As I said, my name is Mark Hickman, and I am a 2007 graduate of the University of Richmond and the Jepson School.
Good afternoon, I'm Professor Tony Ellis from Virginia Commonwealth University Department of Philosophy.
I'm Mike Williams. I'm a with the Richmond Times-Dispatch newspaper.
I'm Lynn Uzel. I am a research fellow here at the Jepson School of Leadership Studies.
I'm Jill Willett. I'm a senior at UNC, English and philosophy major.
I'm Thomas Cox. I'm a senior in philosophy and economics at North Carolina.
I'm Allie. I'm at North Carolina, obviously, and I'm a senior double majoring in economics and history.
I'm Jeff. I'm also a senior at North Carolina, and I'm double majoring in philosophy and economics.
My name's Trent. I'm a senior, and I'm double majoring in philosophy and mathematics.
I'm Nana. I'm a senior, and I'm double majoring in biology and philosophy.
I'm Danielle. I'm a sophomore, and I am a philosophy, political science double major.
I'm Mike, and I'm a senior and a double major in English and philosophy.
And I'm Kayla Smith. I'm a junior double major in biology and philosophy.
Great, thank you very much. So we'll go ahead and proceed with the coin toss to determine which team will be team one. I'm actually just going to allow the coin to fall right on the floor so everyone can see it. And why don't you call it when I throw it?
Heads.
Oh.
So everyone can see it.
All right, it is heads. So UMBC is team one. If the judges would write the university names, appropriate score sheets. Right, semifinal round. Team one's question.
Are they going to go first or second?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, definitely. Would you like to go first or second?
Yes. We went first.
All right. So you will be. Yes, you will be. No, definitely. All right. Thank you. All right. So team one's question. I will read the question. So semifinals, team one, your case is case number one, minding your ethics. Your question is, should John confront the men about their beliefs? If so, why? If not, why not? I'll give each team a copy of the question in the case. I'll read the question once more. Case number one, your question is, should John confront the men about their beliefs? If so, why? If not, why not? All right, team one, you'll now have 2 minutes to confer, beginning now. Ms. Conferring?
Mhm.
All right. Of course, you will now have 10 minutes. How would you like your time notifications?
If we could have a notification of 5 minutes and 1 minute, please.
5 minutes and 1 minute.
Thank you.
All right, and you'll now have 10 minutes to respond to the question. One spokesperson may respond beginning now.
Thank you very much for your question. Recently, this was something that was in the news a lot, so you guys have probably heard this. There was a student at Rutgers who committed suicide shortly after a video was leaked to the internet. This was a male student, and the video depicted a clandestine recording of his sexual encounter with another man. Like I said, shortly thereafter, the student committed suicide, and this recording was taken by the student's roommate. I bring this up because it is relevant to this case, because it's this sort of marginalization and ridicule that John, sitting in the bar, finds so objectionable, and that's going to be part of the basis for my argument. So should John confront the men in the bar about their beliefs? Yes. Yes, he should. We have several reasons for this, but I think that first of all, it's important in this particular case to identify where exactly John decides that he should confront the men, or where this train of thought comes from. Upon sitting in the bar, upon overhearing these comments, John is motivated by this sense that he either has to confront the men or he must leave the bar. It states this explicitly. He realizes he will either have to confront the men or leave the bar. In this instance, John is identifying what he perceives to be an ethical duty. Now, purely from that standpoint, if he feels that he should act in a certain way, then he certainly should do so. Now, in this particular case, and in similar cases, it's important to identify where speech becomes action. Because speech is considered action oftentimes. For example, the Supreme Court has consistently ruled that speech used in such a way as to incite violence is not protected by free speech under the Constitution, under the First Amendment. And this is relevant to this case because there is a point at which speech becomes action. But the point here is that John's action in this case is not confrontational. He isn't aiming to impose upon the men. When he realizes that he has to say something, he is motivated by the regard he feels for his friends who do happen to be homosexual, and for his empathy for those who are not here to represent themselves in this debate. In a sense, he feels that he must take up the role of a surrogate opponent in this case, in hearing homosexuality spoken about in such a manner. One of the important things about John's motivation to speak up is that in any situation where conversation is being dominated by a certain viewpoint, it's important to create a tension of ideas, because that is where we get social and moral progress. Martin Luther King Jr., in fact, in a letter from a jail in Birmingham, wrote that without that tension of ideas, without the introduction of the idea that, for example, African American citizens should be given equal civil rights, without that introduction of a new perspective, change in dialogue will not occur. And it's the same sort of thing here. This isn't to imply that the people in the bar are all agreeing with these men. It's simply to demonstrate the importance of introducing a fresh perspective in dialogue and making sure that in situations like this, or dialogue is dominated by a single viewpoint, that all sides are fairly represented. Now, it can be argued that John has no right to intrude upon the conversation that these men are having in the bar. And that's a valid point. It's very important to consider the right that people have to privacy. And we certainly do not wish to argue that people have a right to simply impose their views wherever they see fit. What's important about this case is that this conversation is occurring in a public place, in a bar. So this is somewhere where people come together where they know that other people will be around, and where they know that there's a possibility that their conversation will be overheard. This is particularly the case here, where this conversation was being held in such a manner that it was overheard and was offending someone else at the bar. When you go out into a public forum, you have a certain reasonable expectation of privacy. And to sit and talk loudly at a bar of all places about something as volatile and hotly debated as homosexuality, you're ceding to a large degree that reasonable expectation of privacy simply by virtue of being out in public and talking about something that is of concern to so many people. Now, John's actions at this point should not be interpreted as an imposition on these men. It's like I mentioned earlier that speech does at a certain point become action. This is true not just from a legal perspective, but also just from a moral perspective. Often the best way to take a moral stance on something is to simply state your perspective on it and let that stand for itself and make that known that that opinion is out there. It's the same sort of thing going on here. When John feels motivated to talk to these men, his immediate thought is not, I could change their mind. He is immediately motivated by his empathy for his homosexual friends and by the fact that this trend, that homosexuality, is being spoken of in such a derogatory manner. That's what motivates him, not any desire to change the men's minds. So when he decides that he wants to confront them, it's not from a desire to sway their viewpoint or to preach at them. He simply wants to make his empathy and his view known. And in this situation, in this public forum, that seems to be perfectly acceptable. Now, going back to the core question here, should John confront the men about their beliefs? Again, our answer is yes. Yes, he should. Just to review our reasons why this is so, the goal of speaking up here is what's important. Because when John realizes that he must speak up, there he's identifying a moral duty and what he considers to be a moral duty. And having identified that moral duty in these particular circumstances, in a public forum where something is being addressed in such a manner that he is overhearing the conversation, having identified what he considers to be this moral duty, he should act on it, particularly since the group that he is speaking up on behalf of is not there to speak up for themselves. And it's also important here to keep in mind the role that this would play in public debate generally. It is important always to consider the effects that your actions have both on the views of the society you live on and the values that you are creating for yourself and for others around you. That's why this tension of ideas is so important, so that we can avoid the marginalization and ridicule, in this case, that caused a student to take his life, and in other cases more generally, to make sure that public debate does not become closed for fear of infringing too severely upon other people's privacy, particularly where it does not exist. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Team 2 will now have 1 minute to confer, beginning now. Minute is over, and now you will have 5 minutes to comment. How would you like your time notifications to be?
I think we'll keep our own time, so if you could just give a hand signal of about 1, just so that we know.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Sure. Your 5 minutes will begin now.
Okay, so first of all, we would love to congratulate UMBC for making it this far, and for competing with us, and to the judges for allowing us to compete. We appreciate it greatly. I think our first of all, I think while we appreciate your perspective and find it very interesting, I think we disagree with you that in fact John should not take up a stand. And one of the important components we want to bring up in order to support this position and show the tension between our two sets of beliefs is this idea that you brought up, this idea of word becoming action. And you talk about the potential consequences associated with the things that these men are saying. And one thing to understand is that if he's dealing with potentially inebriated people in a bar, I think it specifies that they're men, that there's always the danger, of course, their aggression being targeted directly at him if he chooses to stand in. He could be subject to violence. And I think given the context as it's described here, it seems that that's a perfectly reasonable responsibility. So we don't want to endow John with an ethical obligation that's going to put him in harm's way and make him the victim of a senseless crime. This seems to actually work against the notion of equality. And secondly, if they're saying things that are suggestive of violence or which actually genuinely denigrate the basic human dignity of homosexuals in a manner that seems to suggest that they will commit acts of violence, then he needs to contact the police rather than confront them directly. It seems like the inappropriate venue of authority.
Right. As you stated in your case, since the goal for John for speaking up is what's most important, we would also like to for you to elaborate on your consideration on whether or not his interrupting of the conversation and explaining to the gentleman why they hold this incorrect view of homosexuality could potentially lead to more conflict and lead to almost a paternalism aspect of saying what is wrong of them, and especially if these individuals are not in the appropriate state of mind to take in this consideration and rationalize it and think about it.
So I have some issues perhaps you could clarify with several phrasings you use. So you mainly use John as an example, but then you go and you apply that to pretty much all cases here, that you say, well, what he considers a moral duty. John should do so if you believe it's wrong, that there is moral progress and there must be this tension of ideas. This is applied to all issues. For example, if there's a discussion about the Holocaust, and someone who very much believes is a Holocaust denier, who very much believes that it's his moral duty to correct these people about the fact of what he perceives to be completely wrong, then does he have a moral obligation? Does this tension of ideas suddenly progress that he must go and say, actually, you're absolutely wrong, it's my moral duty to tell you that in fact the Holocaust did not happen?
Just going off that, or another point that you guys brought up, you kept talking about the rights that people have to, in a public forum, whether they have a right to privacy or not. And your contention was that basically if you speak loud enough, you no longer have this right to privacy. But we would contend that a group of people discussing their beliefs is not an invitation in a public place to an open forum for anybody to just invite themselves into their conversation, that seems to be some kind of violation of an autonomy of people's right to have a private conversation.
Additionally, towards the beginning of your argument that you gave is that since John has only two decisions to make, either confront the men or leave, we were wondering if there is sort of any sort of middle ground with this, whether or not there are more than just two options available and they aren't mutually exclusive. Does that actually change how we should approach the men, whether he should even approach them at all?
Furthermore, you make this phrase of concern to so many people as if there's a hierarchy of moral duties, that the bigger a concern is to so many people, the more of a duty you have to speak of it. So does this mean that certain issues that might not be as controversial as, say, homosexuality in this bar, the certain case, then they have less of a duty, a moral duty, or they're of less importance to discuss in the public?
Finally, we'd like to question your assertion that John has a moral duty to confront these men because he perceives a moral duty. The question that we have is there an actual moral duty that exists? Or is just the perception of a moral duty something that creates a moral duty? And finally, we wonder if fair representation of all sides in a debate is required for that debate to be moral. We were very concerned with the fact that all sides weren't covered, as Ally discussed earlier. So we wonder if fair representation of all sides is required in all cases, and if this creates a sort of moral duty.
Nevertheless, we think that you guys put up a very excellent argument, and we also would like to thank you again for making it this far in the round. We just have a few contentions within your argument that we just like to be addressed.
All right, thank you. Team 1, you'll now have 1 minute to confer, beginning now. All right, 1 minute is over. You'll now have 5 minutes to respond, and how would you like your time notifications?
I'd like a time notification at 2 minutes and again at 1 minute, if that's
All right,
okay.
2 minutes and 1 minute. All right, your 5 minutes begin now.
You mentioned that John shouldn't confront the men because in confronting the men might be violent towards him, but I think you're inappropriately assigning responsibility to John. It's not John's responsibility to avoid expressing his opinion just because he's afraid people are going to react in a violent manner. It's the men's responsibility not to be violent when other people express their opinions to them. You also made a comment that John shouldn't be considered morally obligated to express his views, and perhaps we weren't 100% clear on this, but we're not saying that you always 100% time are obligated to express your views in all situations. What we're saying is that if you feel that it's your moral duty to express your opinions in a situation, only at that point does it become morally important for you to go ahead and express your opinions. And I know this sounds complicated, but let me give you an example. If you're walking past a burning building and somebody's screaming in the burning building, you might think to yourself, I don't have a moral obligation to go in and save that person. I have children at home that I need to take care of. I can't risk my life in this manner. And then in that case, you wouldn't be morally obligated to save the person from the burning building. But if you walk past the burning building, hear the person screaming and say, you know what, it's my moral duty to save them, and then decide that you're just too scared to do it, that's morally incorrect. And it's the same situation here. John can make a decision that it would not, he can decide that he's not morally obligated to confront these men because he's afraid of getting hurt and he has children to support or such and such and such and such. But if he hears what they're saying, strongly disagrees with it, and feels that he's morally obligated to say something and yet doesn't say something, that's that's a problem and that's immoral. You also mentioned that an example about a Holocaust denier. Should a Holocaust denier go ahead and express their views? Do they have a moral obligation to express their views? And I would say absolutely 100% they have a moral obligation to express their views. I mean, we know right now that the Holocaust did happen, and that in fact a Holocaust denier would be incorrect in his assertions. But we have to recognize that this tension of ideas has to exist for a reason. Several hundred years ago, suggesting that an African American slave had the same value and the same intelligence as a white person would be considered just as ridiculous an assertion as the fact that the Holocaust didn't exist today. But it's important that you disagree, that you create these disagreements despite the conventions of the time, despite the assertions of the time, so that you can perhaps overcome them if they're incorrect and reach a higher level of morality. I mean, if it weren't for these, ludicrous people walking around asserting, the human rights of African Americans, back, 100 years ago, where would the civil rights movement be today? You also made a comment about calling the police in this situation, which just confused me a little bit, and maybe I don't see how you can call the police in this situation. You're allowed to express your opinions, making a comment against homosexuality isn't a crime, and that's why we need to express ideas against it. If we find certain ideas and certain assertions to be morally reprehensible, such as the idea that homosexuals are evil or whatever, we can't arrest people for those opinions, but what we can do is, as a society, we can express opinions, express our opinion that we find that is wrong, and that's the way that we can condemn those actions, and that we can condemn those thoughts rather than by getting the police involved, because quite frankly that's impractical and is a restriction on your free speech. John Stuart Mill actually made a comment upon this, that we shouldn't punish people for having ideas contrary to ours. We need to allow for the freedom of expression. But if you strongly disagree with certain ideas, and you want to condemn them, the way to do it is to do so in a socially acceptable manner, to show your condemnation through your actions and your words, et cetera, et cetera. So overall, we still agree that John has a moral obligation to confront the men, because he feels that he has a moral obligation, because he wants to create a tension of ideas, because he wants to assert that homosexuals are people too. And we need to respect them as human beings. And by putting his ideas out there, he's creating a tension such that eventually, hopefully, fewer people will condemn homosexuals for being homosexuals, and homosexual individuals won't feel the need to jump off bridges if they're being ridiculed.
All right, thank you, Team 1. All right, now we will proceed with the questions from the judges, which will last for a total of 10 minutes. I will start the time, and you can confer briefly. If you'd like, I'll let you know when 1 minute has passed, and then you can begin the questions before or after that. All right, your 10 minutes begin now. All right, 1 minute has passed. I'll actually give you the full 10 minutes to question. One thing I did want to ask is that you each give each other the opportunity to ask one question before a follow-up question, so that way we can make it through all three judges. All right, your 10 minutes begin now.
As I understand the argument, you have two main arguments. One is that there's just an intrinsic duty to express one's opinion, stand up for what one believes in. The other is that a more consequentialist sort of argument that this helps to foster diverse opinions, Mill's free market of ideas and so on. I just want to focus on the first argument. The first argument seems to base itself on the principle that if you have a duty, then if you think you have a duty, then you have that duty. And I just want to ask two questions about that. First, that doesn't seem to me that it can be right. I mean, no doubt lots of Nazis thought they had a duty to murder Jews. I mean, I hardly think that they did have a duty to do that, so the second proposition couldn't really follow from the first. It might follow in some limited circumstances, of course, but not that it follows generally. And it might follow in these particular circumstances, but then there's a question of, I mean, how important is this intrinsic duty? I mean, you're clearly saying he has a duty here that may put him in harm's way himself. That surely has to be given some weight. I mean, why should it be that the intrinsic duty to speak up for what you believe in should, just as it were, immediately outweigh his concern for his own interests? So that's sort of 2 points.
Thank you for your question. You brought up a good point about the nature of duty, and I think it's important to address that here because the duty that I wish to identify here is to act in what you perceive to be an ethically upright manner. That is as far as I want to take that idea. Certainly, you can pull the Nazis in. You can say, well, these people, yes, maybe they perceived they had a duty, and maybe they did, and maybe in those circumstances, acting purely on that duty, they did what was right. Now, the consequences that followed from their actions are a different story. And obviously, we don't want to tell John, you should do this, regardless of whether or not you'll get hurt. But the thing is, in identifying this duty of his, John is the one sitting in the bar. John is the one who's evaluating the circumstances. And John is the one who identifies for himself 2 courses of action, either to confront the men or leave.
And just to add on to that, to reiterate some of the things that my colleague was saying in a little bit more of a clearer way, from the Nazis' perspective, if they believed that the correct thing to do was to, do what they did, then they would be violating their moral code and doing what is wrong from their point of view in committing those actions. But that's very much distinct from an outsider's point of view, and the outsider's point of view is that what they were doing was wrong, and so from the outsider's point of view, it was the outsider's moral obligation to stop what the Nazis were doing. I mean, the plain fact is and I don't want to get into a bunch of determinism kinds of issues, but the opinions that we have often aren't necessarily logical. They can be shaped by violent societies. The best that we can do is to do what we think is right and hope that if we're wrong, enough people will realize it to stop us.
If you grew up in the 60s, I'm sympathetic to this gentleman's plight, and I know how I would probably respond to it. If you grew up in the 60s, you heard, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And you probably read Martin Luther King saying something to the effect of, the moment a man stops speaking out about something that matters, he begins to die. But I'm wondering if we're considering all the options. I'm wondering what you're instructing this gentleman, John, to do. What is he to say to this person? Is he to confront this person on his views and argue his views? Or, as I'm reading this case, it seems the problem is that the views become public. Would it solve the problem as we perceive it if John told the guy, look, keep it down? Is it, or does that not get to what we need to have done here?
I'd actually like to do this real quick because it's a very interesting point, and it's a very relevant point. We can't guarantee that John's going to be able to change the men's minds. So if that's
he doubts it.
Yeah, he doubts it. I mean, it's very difficult to change minds that are set in that kind of prejudiced way. But the goal isn't necessarily in this case to change this particular person's mind. It's to change society's mind as a whole, and that requires the efforts of individuals going ahead and speaking their minds to create this huge conglomeration of ideas interacting with each other. And it's only when you've got all of these conflicting ideas represented by individuals coming together that it becomes more socially acceptable to accept people for who they are. So, I mean, the goal isn't to change these individuals' minds. It's to change society's minds by acting morally.
All right, my question actually relates to that, and that is that, as you have said, the motivation for John is not to change these men's mind, but only to express his own empathy. And that seems to me in tension with what you're saying the outcome is going to be. If his motivation is merely to express his own empathy, is that a high enough good to put himself in harm's way? And if the outcome is going to be somehow moral progress in society, how does that come about by this private conversation with men whose minds he doesn't think are going to change?
Again, we are not the ones sitting in the bar. We can't judge the particulars of the situation, and we certainly can't judge from here the threat that John feels. What we can know, what we can at least judge from this perspective, is that small things tend to build into larger things. In this particular instance, if John decides that he ought to act in such a manner and then decides that he isn't going to, it's symptomatic of a tendency to let the moral duty slide, to let what we feel is right take backseat to what is convenient. And again, we don't want to put John in harm's way. But in this case, especially since he's already decided that he could confront these men without serious threat to his life, apparently, I mean, he's identified this himself, then it seems that particularly in this case, we're not asking John to put himself in harm's way. We're simply asking him to act in what he has already identified as an ethical manner.
And just to add to that, even if he did know that he was in harm's way, don't we want to assign autonomy in individuals the right to decide what moral ideologies they're willing to sacrifice themselves for? I mean, there's the concept that there are some things, some ideologies that people are willing to die for or get beat up for in the middle of a bar. And if he really feels offended by this and he really feels that he needs to defend his friends, doesn't he have the right to say, you know what, I don't care if I get beaten up. This is wrong and I'm going to say something about it.
Can I follow that up? I mean, there's a distinction here between whether he has a duty to do this and whether he has a right to do it. And we might all agree that he has a right to do it. It doesn't follow from that, of course, that he has a duty to speak out. Now, let's say that you've argued successfully that he does have a duty to speak out. Couldn't someone say, well, yes, that's a fair enough duty, but he also has a right to look after his own well-being? And why should it be that the duty here overrides the right? Why shouldn't the right to be concerned about his own well-being overrides the duty?
In this case, where John has identified for himself a duty, it seems that he's already considered that right of his to look after his own well-being, particularly since this is occurring in a public setting where he probably has already thought about the fact that these men might be It's getting late, we've been speaking all day, it's difficult to be articulate all day. But in this case, it seems that right to look after your own well-being, it's definitely important. It's certainly a consideration, and it seems that it's already been addressed by John in this particular setting. Because for him, leaving the bar is an option too.
30 seconds left. Any additional follow-up questions? All right, then we will end there. That is the end of the first case. The judges will score the two teams. Please do not confer with each other at this point, and I will collect your notes. Are the judges finished scoring the first question, first case? All right. Then we will proceed with the second question. So I will, this is for Team 2. Right, and Team's 2 question is, case number 3, Spanish ban on bullfighting. Your question is, do you think bullfighting should be banned as animal cruelty? If so, why? If not, why not? So again, this is semifinals Team 2. Your case is case number 3. Your question is, do you think bullfighting should be banned as animal cruelty? If so, why? If not, why not? All right, Team 2, you will now have 2 minutes to confer, beginning now. All right, the 2 minutes are over. You will now have 10 minutes to respond to the question, and how would you like your time notifications?
Could you please raise, just let me know at 1 minute?
At 1 minute.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right, your 10 minutes begin now.
First of all, I'd like to thank UMBC and our judges for taking time out of their busy schedules on a Saturday to come down and discuss a very interesting case. And to start off, the question is, do you think bullfighting should be banned as animal cruelty? If so, why? If not, why not? And actually, bullfighting is a twofold issue here. So I would like to first kind of give an overview of bullfighting itself, but also bullfighting in a larger context. Its cultural context, its economic context, and its social context. I would then like to kind of give an overview of how Spain has taken measures in all 3 of these contexts, and then I would like to bring up some objections to the case, as this is a very, very kind of complicated case. So in the moral sense, in a vacuum by itself, is bullfighting animal cruelty? Well, bullfighting is given the context of a bull is led out into an arena. It is the inevitable conclusion for the bull is death. That is, it's a type of art form where a matador and a bull battle each other, and the bull is expected to die. Not for food, not for clothing, not for some sort of compensation for humans that is necessary for us to survive, for what has been called entertainment. So that alone in a vacuum does define the fact that yes, bullfighting is absolute cruelty. It is animal cruelty, and thus it should be banned in this vacuum. However, life is not as simple as that. In an ideal world, bullfighting obviously wouldn't exist because of the violation to a sentient creature. Because it must be realized that a bull is a sentient creature, that it is aware of the fact that it is being hurt for no other reason than the fact for entertainment and what Spain has called an art form. However, we'd like to kind of discuss a bit the issues at play here in Spain, because there's been the big struggle between bullfighting as animal cruelty and bullfighting as culture, bullfighting as an economic booster, bullfighting as social expression in Spain. And we're going to go through all three of these contexts and show that actually these arguments are not strong enough to say that there is a moral wrongdoing in killing the bull for nothing but entertainment. So the first, our position ultimately is that no, bullfighting should be banned as animal cruelty both in a vacuum and both in Spain. But we're also going to discuss how Spain has actually taken measures because they do realize that this is animal cruelty. So the first argument that always comes up against why bullfighting should not be termed as animal cruelty, but as culture, is the fact that it has been an art form that deserves to be protected and has been part of Spanish culture for centuries. However, it should be noticed that culture is not static. Culture evolves. American culture that was very popular 200 years ago is probably not the American culture that is during present time. So the first idea that culture is an absolute argument to end the fact that this is animal cruelty cannot stand. The next question that would come up is cultural relativity. The fact that, oh, it's Spain, this is not America, we cannot go into a culture and somehow impose our own views on it, that it's wrong. Well, there are certain objections, and we can't sit here and say cultural relativity is okay when a sentient creature is being killed for entertainment. However, we do respect the fact that we don't want to be cultural and imperialistic, and Spain itself has taken its own measures to stop bullfighting. So the next question here is the idea of this economic argument, that actually bullfighting should not be considered animal cruelty whatsoever, but in fact an economic tradition that Spain very dearly depends on. This is somewhat true. Millions of tourists come to Spain every year to watch bullfighting. This is something we will not argue. However, we would also like to point out that Spain, Catalonia, the autonomous region of Catalonia, has actually passed several bans on Spanish bullfighting. And they've done this of their own accord. There was no kind of paternalism pushing them towards that. And there was none of this cultural imperialism on that. In fact, a lot of Spanish people felt that it was animal cruelty, that it should be banished. So the next issue is this idea of social expression, that Spain gets a pass, that bullfighting gets a pass because it's not animal cruelty, it's simply social expression, that we are somehow enjoying this idea of Spanish sport. Again, this is very, very problematic because this is a sport that actually does damage to people. This isn't poker, this isn't pool. This is something that has very negative consequences towards an animal, someone who is animal that is sentient and aware of the fact that it is being killed for no particular reason in order to survive. Now, it's very, very difficult to make this case without realizing that there would be some inevitable objections to the fact that I stated that the economic, the cultural, and the social issues at play here somehow argue that Spain needs bullfighting, that it's not animal cruelty, it shouldn't be banned, it's an integral part of their culture. However, Spain themselves have made a progression here, and they've realized that this is not really cultural or political or economic reasoning, but this is actually animal cruelty. There have been several bans, several state bans and attempts in the autonomous communities of Spain to banish bullfighting. And of course, there have been people who have argued this, that, this is unfair, that bullfighting is an art form. Bullfighting is economic progression. Bullfighting is a social expression. However, Spain has taken several steps itself to make sure that animal cruelty that's being shown in bullfighting is not affected in these three ways. So first of all, Spain has acknowledged the fact that culture evolves. They don't do other practices, and other countries don't do practices that we've realized in the end that are wrong. Second of all, economically speaking, the fact that Spain has allowed these bans to come into their governments, the fact that Spain has openly and actively wanted these bans, means that economically they realize that the benefits of the economy do not weigh out the benefits of being the moral duties of not hurting animals. And lastly, this idea of social expression, well, Spain has been very, very big on the fact that they realize that, in fact, it's not social expression. In fact, it's some sort of very, very dehumanizing, very, very big issue on animal cruelty. Now, to summarize the case here, because this has very big issues on several fronts here, bullfighting in a vacuum is obviously animal cruelty. Again, defined in the case, it is killing a bull for entertainment, and not just a quick, humane way of just shooting the bull in an artery that would cause instantaneous death. It's a long, drawn-out death for the entertainment of a crowd so they can watch a certain type of art form or a certain type of struggle between the matador and the bull. So in a vacuum, obviously, bullfighting is animal cruelty and it should be banned. However, we do not live in an idealized world. Because of this, we have to consider the context of bullfighting. We would love, I think, tomorrow to ban bullfighting in Spain because it is animal cruelty. However, an automatic ban of animal cruelty would create moral harm in Spain as well because there are millions of Spaniards who do depend on the bullfighting industry. And so what we suggest instead of an automatic ban, is instead this idea of progressed banning. The fact that Spain itself, as its sovereignty, has taken several steps to little by little, not perhaps ban outright now's bullfighting, but in fact kind of little by little temper it, so as to not automatically hurt its Spanish people, for a sovereignty has duties to people as well, but it's a kind of a progression of little by little stopping Spanish bullfighting and stopping the animal cruelty that occurs. So once again, the Spanish government is well aware of the fact that millions of tourists come to watch bullfighting, that it's an economic goldmine for its people. The fact that Spain, again, has 20% unemployment in the recent economic crisis is a big issue for them. But at the same time, they realize that animal cruelty is a fundamental moral wrong, that the fact that the bull is being killed is, for the Spanish government, impermissible. However, they do realize that they have duties to the Spanish people, and by doing this, instead of doing an automatic ban, which in an ideal world would be good for animal cruelty, they've instead done a progressive ban in order to stop moral harms that might be done to the Spanish people as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, Team 1, you will now have 1 minute to confer, beginning now. Team 1, you will now have 5 minutes to comment. How would you like your time notifications?
We would like a time signal at 2 minutes and again at 1 minute, if that's okay.
Of course, we'll do. All right, your 5 minutes begin now.
The first thing that we want to address is, first of all, we agree for the most part. We think that bullfighting is both immoral and it should be banned, although there's a distinction between those two issues. But the reasons why we think bullfighting should be banned and the reasons why we think bullfighting is immoral are drastically different from yours. First of all, you kind of automatically assumed that the bull was a sentient creature that had the ability to suffer in the same sense that human beings suffer. And quite frankly, although several scientific experiments have been done, it's not yet conclusive whether or not animals such as bulls and other higher mammals have the ability to suffer in the same sense human beings do. For example, if you try to poke a worm through a hook, it's not actually feeling any pain. It doesn't have the cognitive ability to do so. It's a reflexive action, just as if a doctor were to hit your knee with one of those little hammer thingy-majigs. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit more complicated in animals, but you need some sort of cognitive reasoning in order to perceive pain. It's not something that's just caused by the application of stimuli. We've all experienced this where we're playing in a sport, we might severely injure ourselves, but we don't actually notice that we have a huge gash in our legs until we actually look down and realize what has happened, because it's a perceptual thing. But it's precisely for this reason that we think that bullfighting should be banned. The bull might not be sentient, but it might be sentient. And if it is sentient and if it can feel pain, it's better to play this, do the safe than sorry game and not allow the bull to be harmed. Although you didn't really focus on the suffering of the bull so much as the killing of the bull, And that's our main problem, is that the bull might be suffering during the course of the bullfighting. I mean, it's getting stabbed with 5 centimeter inch, freaking banderellas are getting thrown at it from horses. That's gotta freaking hurt, if the bull can feel pain in the sense that human beings can. But that's the main issue here, not necessarily the killing. We eat animals because we're omnivores, and it's just part of the natural state of things that we eat animals. It's the killing that's not a problem, it's the suffering that's a problem. And so you'll notice that when we kill animals, we'll administer an electric shock to them so that they can't feel any pain when we kill them and eat them. So that's what we need to be focusing on, the suffering. We also think that an important reason to ban bullfighting is the effect that it has on people. When you go to a bullfight, it's true, you're not going to see the suffering of the bull, you're not going to see the suffering of the animal. You want to see a big, strong matador face off a bull, and survive. That's what you want to see. But in order for the matador to have any chance, you have to cause suffering to the bull. You have to injure it in some way. And so as you're watching the spectacle, as you're enjoying the spectacle, in order to enjoy it, you have to become apathetic to the screaming and crying and pain behaviors exhibited by another living creature. And it's this kind of apathy that you have to have towards an animal that, true, might not be suffering, but certainly appears to be suffering, that's inherently problematic and that can cause apathy in individuals and might actually cause developmental issues in children. I mean, you're not supposed to show children horror movies and other such things, because showing children very violent actions can cause them to become apathetic towards those violent actions and can cause them to become very violent later in life. So children going to see these bullfights might be excited to watch the matador fight the bull, but the fact that the child is being apathetic towards the suffering of the bull and being taught to, count that as secondary to the entertainment of watching the matador can actually be very problematic when we're looking at that from a social level. I also like that you talked about the considerations the considerations Spain is making when it's going ahead and banning this bullfighting. We agree with you that just because it's cultural, it shouldn't be permitted. Obviously, things like female circumcision can be considered cultural, but we don't promote that in our country. We condemn it. But there is a distinction between it being immoral and banned. We think that bullfighting is immoral, but we think the manner in which it's banned depends, as you said earlier, upon Spain and how Spain wishes to go ahead and implement this progressive banning so that the social and especially economic shock that it could cause to the country of Spain if it were all initiated at once and banning occurred all at once can be avoided, and we can go ahead and solve this problem in a progressive manner, which is less likely to economically harm individuals in Spain and cause them problems. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Team 2, you will now have 1 minute to confer, beginning now. Ready? All right, Team 2, you will now have 5 minutes to respond to Team 1's comments. How would you like your time?
Could you give us just a signal at 1 minute?
1
Thank
minute.
you so much.
You're welcome. Your 5 minutes begin now.
All right, well, we'd like to first start off by thanking UMBC for their objections to our review, and we'd like to bring up a couple of points that may not have been fully expounded upon earlier. The first thing that you mentioned is that when you mentioned the psychological harm of this apathy to violence, one thing that you mentioned was that these kids were taught that the violence was the main thing that they saw, and not what we mentioned, that societally Spain has this art form, this struggle. And we'd just like to say that we don't actually know that. Your objection was that violence was the main thing that the children were picking up on, and we don't actually are fully aware of that.
To kind of expand on your kind of confusion if the bull suffers or not. Obviously, the bull is not a sentient or does not have as much cognitive development as a human. However, I do believe the question was animal cruelty. And I don't think we can sit here and say, it looks like it's suffering, but we're really not sure. I mean, it's bleeding to death, but we really still can't be sure if it's suffering. The manner in which Spanish bullfighting occurs is that it's meant to be a long death. It is meant to be a long form of entertainment. This is not 5 minutes and then we stab the bull. This is let the bull suffer, let the bull bleed. The way it dies is extremely important, for that's part of what has been called its cultural art form. Furthermore, you kind of contradict yourself with being apathetic when you look at a screaming and yelling animal in pain, but then you also say, we can't really be sure that the animal is in pain. And furthermore, we also address this idea that the animal, this is the main issue, this is the main heart of the matter, the fact that the animal is suffering for no reason at all. You mentioned that we kill animals for food. That is the main point of this argument, the fact that this bull is being killed for no more than entertainment, no more for crowds, that we are not using this bull for food, we are not using it for anything else that humans might need to survive.
Yeah, and to highlight that, actually, something which is important in the context of your objection, there also seems to be a pivotal distinction between slaughtering an animal in a very vicious way for the sake of entertainment and this idea of killing an animal for the sake of sustenance. So, I mean, it seems that actually adds gravitas to this notion of the potential of the animal suffering.
Furthermore, I'm glad we reached a discussion on this idea of progressive banning and the fact that you think that this is Spain's duty, because in some way it is. We do not want to, in any way, shape, or form, show cultural imperialism or the fact that we believe our culture is superior to Spain. As we stated several times in our case, bullfighting in a vacuum, yes, should be banned as animal cruelty. However, we do not live in a vacuum, and bullfighting has several issues in the economic sector, in the social sector, and the cultural sector. This is why we understand that in real life, not in an idealized world, Spain should progressively ban bullfighting as animal cruelty as a way, because it has duties as well, not just ethical duties to not do animal cruelty, but also ethical duties to its people. The fact that if we were to kill an entire industry and have cultural, social, and economic implications that would be terrible for the Spanish people, the Spanish government is wise enough to realize that that is actually moral harm as well. That they have to be careful not to do more moral harm in an attempt to right a moral wrong in animal cruelty.
And the fact that Spain has taken it upon themselves to ban Spanish bullfighting is a very, it gets a nod from our side. We think that this is the appropriate measure to take. It's not that we are instituting a progressive ban on Spanish bullfighting by being here in the U.S. Spain themselves has decided to take on bullfighting and to subsequently ban it, which we give appropriate approval.
So I think our ultimate contention, and to sort of sum this up, is while we think that your arguments are very compelling, in fact, I think one of the reasons we most find them compelling is that they're more or less strictly extensions of our own case. There's a limited amount of novel content, and I think we've addressed most of those objections that were not. And essentially, in the context of, like, for instance, the animal suffering or dying senselessly, and the potential positive effects of staggering the ban, we feel that we were more or less in agreement, and there wasn't actually a tension brought up in your sequence of objections, as compelling as they were.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. All right, the judges will now have 1 minute to confer before 10 minutes of questioning, and if I may recommend that you just begin in reverse order for your questions. All right, your 1 minute begins now. judges. Your 1 minute is over, and please remember to allow each one of you to ask one question before posing any follow-up. So we'll begin. We now have 10 minutes beginning now.
The question that I have has to do with your grounds for calling animal cruelty immoral, and that is based entirely on the sentience of the animal, that is, its ability to feel pain. But if that is the case, then isn't it superfluous to add what the animal is being harmed for? Because even if we all agree that the animal feels pain, the animal never knows what it's being harmed for. And so if it imposes on the human being a duty not to harm the animal because it's sentient, doesn't that spread into harming the animal for any reason? Medical, experimentation, sacrificing the animal to the gods, any other purpose?
If I may. So obviously our main point was, of course, with the sentience of the animal and the potential that it suffers. But I don't think that that necessarily gives us a carte blanche to dismiss consequence. So it may be that the consequence in some cases is significant enough to justify the harming of animals. We often feel the consequence is sufficient for feeling that we're justified in harming people. And maybe, and sometimes even potentially people that are innocent bystanders, as in like collateral casualties during bombings or something like that. So at the very least, it seems to magnify the effect of the disgust we ought to feel for what's going on in these rings. But I think in addition to that, the consequences are relevant. The fact that like when an animal may be slaughtered or hurt for a just reason, as opposed to one that seems more or less senseless.
To further up on your claim, you make this analogy between medical testing versus Spanish bullfighting. To kind of follow what Tom says, there seems to be a benefit in the end on animal testing that seems to outweigh the negatives of this animal cruelty, while this is somewhat senseless and just meant for entertainment.
Just hearing this entire discussion, I'm thinking of American regional form of entertainment from which its participants derive economic benefit. That would be dogfighting. Now, dogfighting is illegal, and I don't think anyone here will rise up in defense of dogfighting. Hate to keep evoking Martin Luther King, but I'm just, throughout this, I hear him talking about the intoxicating drug of gradualism. I'm hearing you make the point and you acknowledge the wrongs of bullfighting, but I hear this conflation of economic considerations. Can you go there? If there's a moral wrong, can you go there and draw it out however long because of economic considerations?
So in this particular case, we cannot deny the fact that economics has ethical implications. That by suddenly killing this industry, there are millions of people who depend on this for their livelihood. And Spain as a sovereignty does have these duties to these people to watch out for them. And we understand, you're absolutely right, that there is a moral wrong here. This is a moral wrong that's been occurring for centuries. However, the fact that we recognize this in an idealized world, that we could end this tomorrow, does not mean that ending this tomorrow wouldn't have negative moral wrongs done to people who work in this industry. And I think it's very important for us to not accidentally do moral harm to the Spanish people by doing moral good to the bull.
Moreover, Spain is in a very economically precarious situation right now. It depended heavily on real estate and also construction for its boom in the recent years, and has subsequently felt the bust of the financial crisis from 2008 to 2010. Right now, it sports a 20% unemployment rate, which is one of the highest, easily one of the highest in Europe, and I think only South Africa is one of the few countries that has a higher unemployment rate, that's 25%. So.
And its only source of revenue currently right now is tourism. And I think the Spanish government does realize that there could be unseen consequences by just ending bullfighting and having all these people who don't really have any other job options in Spain, who rely on tourism, who rely on the tourists who come and spend their money at these bullfightings, to suddenly just end it would have very unforeseen economic consequences, but as an extension, several ethical consequences, where people are kind of thrown into the situation where they somehow have to live, and the one source of like income they could depend on suddenly is gone. Not progressively gone, so they could somehow maybe plan for it. I'm not saying that's perfect, but in the best realistic situation for them.
And to kind of piggyback off that, to use your Martin Luther King analogy with desegregation, while he vehemently opposed perhaps the gradual desegregation, desegregation in certain areas kind of smoothed the way for desegregation across the rest of the country. And while we don't know what would have happened if suddenly the entire United States would have been desegregated instantaneously, we can imagine that the consequences could have been much more severe had it not been a gradual.
Okay, I guess in a way my question really is an invitation to define what you mean by cruelty and also what you mean by art. But let me get at that by posing you a hypothetical. Let's imagine, I mean, it says in the question here that the fight isn't a fair one because the bull is going to die whatever happens. Let's imagine that it was a fair fight, that you simply had a bull loosed upon a guy on a horse or whatever would make the odds even. What would you say about that case? And would it, I mean, you know, you could presumably say it was art. Would that be a
Is this entertainment as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm thinking like the gladiatorial contest.
So, yeah, precisely. And obviously we wouldn't support gladiatorial combat either. In any cases, I think they did precisely that. I think there's an important component in both elements, and I think it's perfectly consistent with what we've addressed so far, and the idea that there is a moral relevance of the suffering of the bull, and it has to be weighted against the moral relevance of suffering of people. And in this case, you're clearly incorporating both. You're setting one person up and sort of objectifying them as something for our amusement and putting their life in grave danger. I mean, I think tautologically, by consequence of your example of 50%, they're given a 50% chance of dying relative to the bull. Yeah, and so, like, in that case, as always, we would find that the potential consequences of harming either party are devastating and unjustifiable, and that we would want to dismiss that practice.
However, there is something to be said about the human awareness of the situation. Human has autonomy. He knows what he's getting himself into. He realizes that there's a 50% chance he is going to die. The bull has no clue that he is putting in some sort of death trap, that there's going to be one victor, him or the human. And because of this actually constitutes, again, as animal cruelty, because you, again, exploited this bull who doesn't have the sentience, with a human that does have the sentience, who has made a choice to enter this game or this form of entertainment.
Yeah. To highlight that a little bit further, humans have this sort of special power over animals. We can control them. We can put this bull in this ring and make him fight. And to do things that are cruel, to hurt animals for our entertainment is an abuse of this power. Just because we have the ability to do this doesn't make it a right thing to do.
Furthermore, it seems like the end result of this match is still entertainment, and that's a consequence that we still don't find appropriate, or still that we're able to deem as animal cruelty.
I mean, why isn't it bull cruelty to the humans? If there's a 50% chance of each.
Well, okay, so I think this is an important distinction, right? So we suppose, I think, to begin with, that humans are autonomous and capable of making their decisions. Now, this may in and of itself be unfair, but I think, given the limited time we have, it's a supposition worth making. But I think the natural inclination is not to assume that the bull is outright autonomous, that it has the same cerebral capacities that a person does. We see very little evidence of this being true. And so an important thing to understand is if we subject them to a particular environment, it's very unlikely that we could ever get any measure of consent from that animal. And so that seems to mean that they're just sort of placing the circumstance without any knowledge of what's going on, and therefore, by sheer nature, without any consideration on their part, required to do what we consider our unethical action. But not unethical on their part, because they understand.
We have over a minute for follow-up questions.
I was going to ask you to elaborate exactly on that last point, which is what I was in some ways trying to drive you toward in that first question. All right, so long as we recognize that the bull is sentient, in what way does that pose a moral obligation? What is our moral obligation to sentient animals, and would we have the same moral obligation if we found out that the cockroach was sentient too?
Yeah, so I think it's twofold, right? A, like when we find out that they're sentient, that it's certainly possible, at least that they're capable of experiencing pain, for instance, then we have a responsibility to not harm them senselessly, as is definitely a danger in these cases, and I think that seems pretty clear, but we also have a responsibility not to put them in these sort of mousetraps, where they're going to be condemned and exploited, and perhaps harm others without any knowledge or sensible reason for doing it. So.
10 seconds left.
Talk real fast.
All right.
Thanks again.
Thank you. All right, I'll allow the judges time to
Score question 2. And I'll go ahead and just pick up your notes.
Next team, please.